Hey, safety pros. Have you ever found yourself kind of scratching your head trying to figure out if an incident is really work-related?
Yeah,
It's one of those things that keeps us all on our toes, right?
it really does.
Well, today we are diving deep into OSHA's 1904.5 standard.
Right.
And this deep dive is brought to you by Safety One Source.
Great.
We're going to break down those guidelines for figuring out work-relatedness.
Okay.
And trust me, there are going to be some surprising scenarios that you might not expect.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It sounds like a really simple concept,
Right.
but it can be a lot more complex than you might think when you try to actually apply it to real-world situations. And so today we're going to unpack some of those kind of gray areas
Yeah.
and help you understand all those little nuances that can make or break a work-relatedness determination.
Exactly. And I think, we think about OSHA's general rule.
Uh-huh.
It's, if something in the work environment caused or contributed to the injury or illness,
Right.
it's work-related. But I feel like when we think about work environment, we often kind of just assume it's like, our office space or wherever we're physically working.
Yeah, that's a really common misconception, and it's something that trips a lot of people up.
Right.
That work environment, as defined by OSHA, actually extends beyond just the physical location.
Okay.
So it also includes any equipment or materials that the employee is using.
Interesting.
So, for example, let's say you have an employee who's working from home,
Okay.
and they get a paper cut
Okay.
from a document that the company provided.
Okay.
That's still considered part of the work environment because it involves materials that were provided by the employer.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't considered that, it would extend to the home office.
Yeah.
Like-
and this is where things can get a little bit,
Right.
murky.
Right.
But OSHA does a good job of laying out some specific exceptions in 1904.5. So just because something happens in the work environment, if it's solely due to personal activities, then it might not be considered work-related.
Right. So like if I stub my toe on my, coffee table at my home office,
Exactly.
that's not
Work-related.
work-related.
Right. And similarly, if you have an employee at work
Right.
and they're eating lunch
Oh.
and they choke on their food,
Right.
that's also considered a personal activity,
Oh.
even though it happened at work.
So even though it happened at work, if it's something completely personal,
Yep.
it's not recordable.
Exactly.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think it's those gray areas
Yeah,
that we really, need to kind of dig into.
absolutely.
So let's say we have, a catered lunch at work
Okay.
provided by the company,
All right.
and someone gets food poisoning.
All right.
Is that personal or is that work-related?
That's a great example.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how those specific details can make all the difference. So in that case, if the food poisoning can be traced back to the food that was provided by the employer
Okay.
as part of like a work event or, a meeting or something like that,
Right.
then it would actually shift from being personal to being work-related.
Interesting. Okay.
Because again, you're connecting it back to that work environment, even though it's an indirect connection.
Yeah. And I bet that's where a lot of safety professionals probably get tripped up
Absolutely.
a little bit.
Yeah.
It's those subtle differences.
Yeah, it's easy to kind of jump to conclusions.
Right.
But it's really important to look those specifics.
Are there any other scenarios like that where we might assume something is work-related because of, maybe the location,
Yeah.
but it actually falls under an exception?
Absolutely. One of the most common examples is commuting accidents.
Okay.
So if an employee is driving to work
Okay.
and they get into an accident in the company parking lot,
Okay.
that's generally not considered work-related.
Really?
Even though it's on company property.
Interesting. Okay.
Because the employee is not considered to be engaged in work activities yet.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's definitely a curveball.
Yeah.
I would not have expected.
It's one of those things that, again, we tend to think about location as being that defining factor,
Right.
but it's not always the case.
So it's really about the employee's activity
Exactly.
at the time of the incident.
It's all about understanding the context.
Okay.
So let's say, for example, you have an employee who's working from home
Right.
and they trip over their dog
Okay.
while they're running to answer a work call.
Okay.
So in that case, even though they're technically working,
Right.
the cause of the injury is really tied to their home environment, not their actual job duties.
Okay. So starting to piece it together here,
Yeah.
it's not just where it happens.
Right.
It's why it happens.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, what about pre-existing conditions?
Okay.
So let's say an employee has, back problems.
Mm-hmm.
They're lifting a box at work.
Okay.
They hurt themselves. Is that automatically work-related?
That's a great question, and that's where the concept of significant aggravation comes into play.
Okay.
So it's not enough to just have a pre-existing condition.
Right.
The work event actually needs to make that pre-existing condition demonstrably worse.
Okay.
So we're not just talking about like a minor flare-up.
Right.
We're talking about a situation where there's a clear link between the work activity and a noticeable change in the employee's condition.
Demonstrably worse. What does that really mean?
Yeah, it can be a little bit subjective.
Right.
But OSHA does provide some helpful indicators
to
kind of give us some more concrete guidance.
Okay.
So some things to consider are, did the work event lead to death?
Oh, wow.
Loss of consciousness? Did it require time off work?
Okay.
Or did it result in a need for medical treatment that wouldn't have been necessary otherwise?
Gotcha.
So those are all key factors to consider.
So we're not just looking for any little, flare-up of a pre-existing condition.
Right.
There needs to be a pretty substantial and noticeable impact.
Exactly.
That is, tied to that work event.
Right.
Okay, now it's starting to really click.
Good.
I think this is really insightful. It seems like there are so many nuances to consider. Do you have any tips for our listeners?
Absolutely.
As safety professionals on how to really navigate these gray areas?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest piece of advice I can give is don't be afraid to ask for help.
Okay.
OSHA has a ton of resources and guidance available.
Okay.
There are experts in the field who can provide support and clarification.
Right.
When you need it.
Okay.
And of course, Safety One Source is always here to help you create those safer workplaces with the right knowledge and tools.
That's a great point. I think that's something we probably don't do enough as safety professionals.
Yeah.
We try to figure it all out ourselves.
We do.
But, there are resources out there.
There are.
And people who can help us.
Absolutely.
So this has been a really fantastic start to our deep dive.
I agree.
We've, kind of laid out some fundamental concepts, uncovered some common misconceptions about work-relatedness.
Yep.
But stick with us, safety pros, because we've got a lot more to explore.
We do.
In part 2, we are going to tackle some even trickier scenarios, including travel status, and the ever-growing world of working from home.
Looking forward to it.
So don't go anywhere.
Stay tuned. Welcome back, Safety Pros. We're continuing our deep dive into OSHA's 1904.5 standard.
Yes, we are.
Brought to you by Safety One Source.
Absolutely.
And I'm really excited to kind of unpack some of these more complex scenarios that I think really challenge even some of the most seasoned safety professionals.
Yes, I'm ready.
Right.
We, in that first part, we laid some of those key principles for determining work-relatedness. But I'm really eager to kind of see how those apply to specific situations.
Yeah, let's do it.
So let's start with travel status.
Okay.
How do we determine work-relatedness when something happens during a business trip?
That's a really common question.
Yeah.
And OSHA actually addresses this pretty directly in the standard.
Okay.
So the general rule is that if an injury or illness occurs while an employee is on travel status, it's considered work-related if they were engaged in work activities in the interest of the employer at the time of the incident.
In the interest of the employer?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
That's a great question.
I'm picturing I'm on a business trip.
Right.
Where are those lines drawn between my work activities and, kind of my personal time?
Yeah, it's not just about physically being at a work site.
Okay.
Think about things like traveling to and from customer meetings.
Okay.
Conducting job tasks, maybe attending like a work-related entertainment event.
Okay.
So if the activity is directly related to the employee's job duties and ultimately benefits the employer in some way, it's generally going to be considered work-related.
So if I slip and fall in my hotel bathroom while I'm on a business trip, is that automatically work-related?
Not necessarily so.
Okay.
When a traveling employee checks into a hotel, they're essentially establishing a temporary home away from home.
Right.
So we need to evaluate their activities within that temporary residence.
Right.
Similarly to how we'd evaluate a non-traveling employee's activities at their actual home.
Gotcha. So if I'm, getting ready for bed or, having dinner just on my own time, those are not work-related.
Not work-related, even though I'm, away from home on a business trip.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Okay, but if I'm, preparing a work presentation in my hotel room.
Right, or you're on a work-related phone call.
Right, or, emailing.
Exactly.
Then
it becomes work-related because, again, you're tying it back to those job duties.
Oh, this is nuanced.
It is.
There are definitely some gray areas here.
There are.
What if I take a personal detour during my business trip and I get injured Like I decide to, do a little sightseeing tour between meetings.
Yeah, that's actually a classic example of an exception.
Okay.
So if an employee deviates from their planned business travel for personal reasons, and they get injured during that detour, it's generally not going to be considered work-related. Because, again, those personal activities fall outside the scope of their work duties.
So the itinerary matters.
It does.
If I stay on track for work, I'm in the clear. But if I decide to take a little detour, that's on my own.
That's on you.
It all comes back to that, connecting it back to those job duties.
You got it.
Okay. I think that's really helpful in kind of untangling some of that travel, complexity.
Let's switch gears and talk about another kind of, hot topic. In the world of safety. And that's working from home.
Of course.
It's become so, so normal for so many of us.
And I'm sure it presents some unique challenges when we're trying to determine, is this work-related or not?
You're absolutely right with that rise in remote work.
Yeah.
Those lines between our work life and our personal life have become increasingly blurred.
Yes, they have.
And so it does make those work-relatedness evaluations a little bit trickier.
So how does OSHA approach work-relatedness for, injuries or illnesses that happen in a home office?
So the key here is to determine whether the injury or illness occurred while the employee was actually performing work for pay or compensation in their home. And if it's directly related to those work tasks rather than just the general home environment.
Can you give me an example?
Absolutely. So let's say an employee is walking to their home office to start their workday. And they trip over their kid's toy. That would probably be considered more tied to the general home environment rather than their actual job duties. So it wouldn't be work-related.
But if that same employee hurts their hand while they're using a work-provided shredder at their home office desk, that would be.
That's work-related because now the injury is directly tied to their work tasks.
Yes.
Using company-provided equipment in their dedicated workspace.
So it still falls under that work-related umbrella.
It does.
Even though it happened at home.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're really drawing a line between things that are inherent to me, performing my job versus those that are just incidental to my home environment.
Exactly.
Regardless of where I'm working.
You got it.
Okay, now what about mental health concerns? Would those ever be considered work-related under OSHA?
So that's a very complex area. And OSHA does have some very specific guidelines related to mental health. But generally speaking, a mental illness is not going to be considered work-related unless the employee provides their employer with a written opinion from a physician or licensed healthcare professional stating that that illness is work-related.
So there's a much higher bar.
There is.
To clear.
Yes.
And really, the employee has the control over whether to disclose that information or not.
Exactly.
Mental health in the workplace.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a whole other can of worms.
It is.
That maybe we should explore in another episode.
Absolutely. It's such a crucial topic for safety professionals, especially now with the increasing awareness of mental health and its impact on the workplace.
Definitely. I'm adding it to the list. This conversation has been so insightful. I feel like I'm starting to see the world through OSHA-colored glasses.
That's great.
Like spotting those little nuances.
That's what we want.
That can impact, those work-relatedness determinations.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to navigate these complex scenarios alone. Safety One Source is here to support you with those resources, the training, the expert guidance that you need to create those safer and healthier work environments, no matter where your employees are working.
Excellent point. This has been so helpful in kind of, untangling some of those complexities.
Good. I'm glad.
Around, this whole idea of work-relatedness. So we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From those common misconceptions to some of those really tricky gray areas that could make or break a work-relatedness determination.
Sure.
But we're not done yet.
No, we're not.
So stay tuned, Safety Pros.
Yes.
Because in our final part, we are going to tackle some practical tips for actually applying these guidelines.
Awesome.
And making sure that your organization stays compliant.
Can't wait.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive Safety Pros. We've been on quite a journey with OSHA's 1904.5 standard.
We have.
Exploring the ins and outs of work-relatedness. And, I don't know about you. I'm feeling a lot more confident.
Good.
In my ability to tackle these kind of tricky scenarios we face every day.
That's what we want to hear. As safety professionals, you guys are really on those front lines of protecting your employees.
Right.
And ensuring that accurate reporting is happening.
Right.
Which is so essential for building that culture of safety.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
brought to you by Safety One Source,
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to kind of circle back
Okay.
to the concept of significant aggravation of pre-existing conditions.
Yeah.
It's a topic that I know often leads to questions and confusion.
It does.
And I think it warrants a little extra attention.
Absolutely. It is a nuanced area.
Yeah.
And it can be challenging to navigate.
So just to recap, it's not enough to simply have a pre-existing condition.
Right. You need that work event to actually demonstrably worsen that condition.
Right. But what does demonstrably worse really mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's where those OSHA indicators that we talked about before can really come in handy.
Okay.
So, did the work event result in death?
Wow. Okay.
Loss of consciousness, did it result in the need for medical treatment that wouldn't have been necessary otherwise?
Okay.
Was the employee unable to perform their normal work duties
Okay.
because of that aggravated condition?
Gotcha.
Those are all red flags that could suggest significant aggravation.
So it's not just any, minor flare-up or temporary discomfort.
Right.
There needs to be a tangible change in, the employee's condition that we can really link back to that work event.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, this is where that meticulous documentation becomes absolutely critical.
Right.
You need to gather all that information about the employee's medical history, the specific details of that work event,
Okay.
any observable changes in their symptoms or their limitations.
Okay.
It's really all about building a clear and compelling case.
I like that it's like, you're piecing together a puzzle.
Exactly.
Gathering all of the evidence to see, does it fit the definition
Right.
of, significant aggravation under OSHA?
Exactly.
I think that's really helpful. Any final words of wisdom
You
for our safety pros out there
Yeah.
who might be feeling a little overwhelmed by all of these nuances?
Don't be afraid to seek guidance.
Yeah.
OSHA has a wealth of resources available to help you navigate all of these complex situations.
Right.
Don't hesitate to reach out to experts in the field.
Okay.
Consult with your legal team if you're not sure about a particular case.
Okay.
And of course, Safety One Source is always here
Yes.
to provide that support, that training,
Right.
and all the tools that you need to build a safer and more compliant workplace.
I love it. This deep dive has been a fantastic reminder that knowledge is truly power.
It is.
When it comes to safety. And, by really understanding those intricacies of OSHA's 1904.5 standard, we can make more informed decisions.
Absolutely.
We can protect our employees.
Yes.
And we can really create that culture of safety that benefits everyone.
That's the goal.
Absolutely well said. So that wraps up our deep dive into OSHA's 1904.5 standard. A huge thank you to Safety One Source for making this episode possible.
Of course.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey.
Yes, thank you.
We'll see you next time for another insightful deep dive into the world of safety. Until then, stay safe out there.